Do you ever look at your paint palette as you're about to begin a portrait and realize, I have no skin colors in this palette? What, you say? Mix my own skin colors? You know how many colors that takes? Like 4. It also requires skill and effort, both of which I have none of. Okay, I'm just kidding. It's not that bad trying to make skin tones with paint. It can definitely be intimidating, which is why I thought it might be nice to try these guys first. So these are the Tombow Dual Brush Pens, and as you can see, I actually have a portrait palette. So that means that hopefully it'll be a little easier to start with the skin tones, because obviously this pack is made for skin tones. So first things first is I'm going to swatch out the portrait set and we'll see what colors that we're working with here. So on the right we have all of our colors, and you know the thing about having no skill or effort, and that's why you had to resort to this, it's still not going to matter, because as you can see, you're still going to definitely have to get creative and mix your own colors here. The truth of the matter is there's only 10 markers, and there's so many skin colors in the world that this is never going to cover all of it. On top of there just not being so many colors if you just got this pack, as you could also see, some of those colors were a little too oversaturated or too much leaning to one of the primaries to be probably a skin tone. Like you could see, this one was very orange, very saturated, but once you do put water on it, it does get lighter. So that's another thing to take into account when you're looking at these. They're watercolors, they're gonna get light when you put that water in there. So as you can see now, that very orange pigment definitely looks a lot better now. However, just like watercolors, if you really want to have a full range of skin tones, you're going to have to blend with other colors. Obviously, there's a lot of blending ability just with these colors, so I still think it'll make it a little easier than starting off with the palette, because to get any type of skin tone, you really want to mix those primaries together, and then depending whether it's dark or light, you can put different types of browns in there, you can add white, or you can add more of a primary to lean towards an undertone. So here, they solve a little bit of that because that base for a lot of the colors is there, but if you want to make it darker, lighter, a little less warm, you're still going to have to take things into your own hands and mix other colors into there. There's 2 different types of methods that I think you can use these markers for. The first one that I'm going to show is the one that I personally like to use, and that's where you draw the markers directly on paper like I did over with our swatches, and then you add water on top to blend it out. I just think that this is the best method to use with these markers. The other method, as you can see, it's really not that different than just using a watercolor palette, so if you like that other method better, I would recommend just getting a palette. But if you kind of like line down your markers first and then just adding a little water on them, I think that works great, especially since these markers, one of their biggest attributes is just how pigmented and beautiful the color is. So by laying that marker directly on the paper, you're going to get a lot more of that pigment, which I really like. And boy, did my paper get ruined using these markers. Unfortunately, my watercolor paper was not working well at all. As you can see, the color pigments were breaking apart and the paper was getting shredded. So I ended up redrawing this on Canson mixed media paper, which is what I swatched out with, and that's what the markers did really well on. I'm assuming since normal markers usually work best on smooth paper, the same thing's going to apply here. So even though they're water-based and you'd think I should use watercolor paper, it's probably going to be better if the paper is smoother. So back to the drawing. As you can see, the first step I use is I take my shadow color and I take my midtone and I put those down. And that's really most of the time all you're going to need, because these colors you can easily use water on and pull them out so that they turn into the lightest shade, and that way they'll blend easier together. Unfortunately, because the pigment really does lighten up super quick, it is definitely hard to get darker shadows. And from my experience working on this, you kind of want to get it correct the first time, because unfortunately it's really easy for these markers to leave that kind of watermark residue like watercolors will do sometimes, but I found that it was doing it a lot more here. Granted, I was also working on that mixed media paper, which probably wasn't helping things, but I definitely realized that usually my first layer was the most flattest, but when I tried to go back in, it was really hard without getting those watercolor marks. Another way I also realized that would help down, obviously, with those watermarks is that you use very little water. With this method, honestly, all you have to do is put your brush in water, take a towel, and wipe off all the excess, and then rub. The brush literally just has to be damp, and that's all the water you need, which is another positive, I thought, because it helps keep the paper more flat. So this was actually really awesome to use in my sketchbook, because I love watercolors, but I hate if you use them in sketchbooks and your sketchbook gets all wrinkly. Another attribute of the markers is that, like watercolors, they are fairly forgiving. You could take a towel and lift up color you didn't want. However, I did think personally that they stain more than watercolors usually will, so I couldn't usually get a complete lift up of like little mistakes of a color I didn't want seeping somewhere. And it was very easy for colors to seep somewhere else, even if the paper was just slightly damp, which made it really hard because a lot of the times, if the paper was slightly damp, I couldn't tell. But the minute I put down a color, it was obvious because it was immediately starting to spread out. Overall, like I said before, this method is my preferred method. I think it really gives such a unique look that you can't really achieve using watercolors or markers. It really is that in-between look. And I also think this method is a lot easier because it helps you get darker tones, which personally in my style, I really like having a nice contrast with darker shadows and lighter tones. So being able to getting the colors dark is really important for me. Now, moving on to the next method, which I really don't like to use, but I've seen a lot of people use it. It's where you take your markers and you rub them on like a palette like you would for watercolor, and then you just use a brush and use that like watercolor. Personally, I think if you're going to do this, you should just go out and get a watercolor palette, but it does have its benefits. It more easily lets you create different types of skin tones as you can mix the colors beforehand. And two, it also lets you get really light colors, I think, more easily. But other than that, I still like the first method more. Now, before how I mentioned that either because of just the way these markers are or because of the type of paper you're going to have to use, that it was very easy to get watermarks on your paper, it unfortunately was even easier with this method because I was obviously using a lot more water because I'm kind of treating the color as watercolors. So unfortunately, this method left a lot of watermarks, which is one reason why I didn't like it. Two, it really is only for the lighter shades. I tried layering and layering and layering, but it seemed like there was just a point where the color just wouldn't get any darker. It just really kept blending back into that base shade of the skin. So it was super hard to achieve shadows. Now, if you were to use this for a really light skin tone like I did on the right side, I think that's totally fine because obviously I didn't want super harsh shadows on that, so it worked well. And two, because the skin tone was so light, you can't really see any watermarks even if they're there. Overall, like I said, this isn't probably a method I'm going to use, at least for portraits, unless maybe it is a super light skin tone. I would definitely stick with the first method, and I think that method 2 is just funner because you're really doing a mixture of both. You're applying the marker like it's a marker piece, but then you get to use your brush like it's paint. So I really like that, and I really think it's a unique medium. And like I said, I think it's really great to have something to like add color in a sketchbook because you can get such crazy beautiful pigments and it won't totally wrinkle your paper. Also, looking at the skin tones once I was done, I was really happy with the skin tone pack. Even though they may not have looked super realistic at first glance, when you actually start using them and shading, I thought the skin tones were very realistic. And when I did the second method and I was mixing my own colors, you can really create a lot of different colors if you chose to do that method as well. So overall, I'm really happy with these markers, and I'm definitely going to start using them more. They really are such a unique medium that's so different than anything else, and I just think they're super fun to use and give a really unique look when you're finished.